Okay, one last concept that I want to talk about here is the idea that that the same hormone can elicit different responses at different targets. Okay, so uh, this is an example of that here. So we're going to look at a hormone called epinephrine, which you may also know by the name of adrenaline. Okay, adrenaline binds to different types of adrenaline receptors. There are a variety of types of adrenaline receptors. Okay, and if we look over here at this intestinal blood vessel, these guys have a receptor to epinephrine called the alpha receptor. Okay. If we look in the skeletal muscle, the blood vessels there have a receptor to epinephrine called the beta 2 receptor. Don't worry too much about the names. The important thing here is that you have two different types of receptors in two different tissues in the body. Okay. So if we look at the effect of epinephrine on these two different targets, you can see that we get different responses, right? So epinephrine here, if we look on the left, it's going to bind the alpha receptor in the intestine, and that's going to cause that blood vessel to constrict, okay? Looking on the right, we have epinephrine binding to the beta 2 receptor in the skeletal muscle, and that is going to cause that skeletal muscle blood vessel to dilate or expand. Okay, so I have a question for you. How can binding different receptors lead to different responses, right? So what exactly is happening? What's different about these two different situations besides the receptors, right? That's going to lead to these two different responses. Okay, so think about that. Hit pause to answer the question. Okay, so hopefully you had an answer to that question, and we'll talk about that answer in class. Okay, so that basically wraps up our discussion of peptide hormones. I want to remind you of all the things that we have been talking about, right? So this table very nicely summarizes the characteristics of the three different classes of hormones. And here, looking at the peptide hormone column, you can see that looking at the synthesis and storage, you might remember peptide hormones are made in advance. Remember, they go through that secretory pathway, and then they're stored in secretory vesicles, right? So they just kind of hang out in those vesicles, and they wait for a signal to tell them to be released from the cell, okay? They're released from the parent cell by exocytosis. They're transported in the blood, dissolved in the plasma, right? So remember that because they're hydrophilic and plasma is an aqueous solution, these hormones, they are very comfortable hanging out in the plasma, okay? This is also going to make a little more sense when we contrast them later with the steroid hormones, okay? The peptide hormones have a short half-life of a few minutes usually. And again, remember that that's because we had those enzymes in the plasma that are going around looking for hormones to break down, okay? They generally bind to receptors on the cell membrane. Again, this has to do with the fact that they're hydrophilic. They cannot just cross that hydrophobic cell membrane. So they're going to have to bind to receptors, okay? And then the kinds of responses that they elicit is they set off these signal transduction cascades, also known as the second messenger systems. They also, you know, this is something that I'm kind of de-emphasizing, but they do also sometimes activate these longer term, what we call genomic effects in the cells, okay? And then if you remember from our discussion of second messenger systems, signal transduction cascades, the sort of end result of that single transduction cascade is to modify existing proteins. Yeah, and induction of new protein synthesis, that's kind of more of a result of activating the genes. Okay, and then here are some examples of peptide hormones. All right. Okay, so that's the end of our discussion about peptide hormones. These are your learning goals for this part of the lecture. Okay, this is your vocabulary. I do want to point out there is a bunch of vocabulary that I didn't put in here that I kind of assume that you know from before. So things like ligand and receptor. Yeah. All right.